Hi, I'm Eva Okrent. I'm a Boston-based artist. I work in a few different mediums: acrylic painting, portraiture, digital illustration, and watercolor. Today we are going to work on abstract watercolor paintings using blind contour as a way to loosen up. So let's get started. What you'll need are your watercolors, some paper, and some things to draw with. So I have an extra paintbrush here, a loose ink pen. This is a Pilot Precise V5. I really like it, and you'll see why in a bit. You could use a Sharpie, and I also have a pencil here. So the first thing that we're going to do just to loosen up is called blind contour. For this one, I'm going to use my pen. And the premise of a blind contour is that you're going to not look at what you're drawing and keep your eye just on the thing that you are drawing. So if you have an object like a plant or a set of paintbrushes or a bowl of fruit, whatever it is, that's what you'll be looking at. And your pen will never lift off the paper. So once you choose a place, you're gonna not look, and you just are observing the outline of the shape that you're making, the contour of it. They're really fun, and they're a really good way to just kind of practice and warm up and get out of your head. And I use these all the time, whether I'm doing a landscape painting or anything. It's a good warm up. So let's get started. So I'm going to choose a place on my paper, and once I have it there, my pen stays down the whole time, and what I'm looking for is just the outline of the shape. And this is how our brain and our eyes are going to connect to our hand. Okay, here we go. And with these, they're not supposed to be slow or take a lot of time. It's just a warm-up. And we're not focused at all on what the inside shape might be. So for these leaves, I'm looking at just the general shape of the individual leaves and not all of the texture that's in them. Oh, I think that's kind of where the pot might be. Do another little one. It's very tempting to look down, but I promise they're really fun when you get to see the surprise after. Okay. So here is our first blind contour. Very loose. It's like a hint of a plant. So what I'm going to do is set that aside. And I would recommend doing a few of those. One is a great warm-up, but the more you do in a row, the tighter it feels in your brain. So for now, I'm just going to set that aside. The next step that we're going to work on is figuring out a little bit of how to use these watercolors. So unlike other paints, watercolors are painted on paper, watercolor paper primarily. Other papers will work, they'll crinkle a little bit, so anticipate having that happen. You're going to need your glass of water, some clean water, and for this part, just think of what your favorite color is. So I love blues, and the past few days in Boston have been surprisingly beautiful. So the sky is this like blue, pretty blue color. So get your paintbrush pretty wet, and you're just gonna add a bunch of water directly onto this color. And if you don't have a little side mixing plate, you can use just a normal, like a white plate, all of this stuff should wash off very easily. Okay, so I'm starting with this blue. Now what we're doing here by taking the paint directly from the palette and onto the paper would be going from wet to dry. So that's what we're going to start with, as opposed to wet on wet, which is when the paper is already a little bit wet. So I've got some blues. I mixed a few together, so that's really the color I like. Get a bunch of water, and now just go for it. However you're feeling. Make this really like fast and uninhibited. We're not trying to make it look like anything. I'm gonna mix in just a bit of green into this blue. Get a little bit more of that going on. So what you'll see now that I've got a little bit of the paper is a little wet, the paints are gonna interact differently as they mix on here. And the more water on the page, the less control you have. So like, as soon as I add that, ready for it? The water is gonna kind of, in this case it kind of looks like a little tie-dye, so you can mix colors first, you can mix colors directly on the paper. There's really no wrong way to get this going. And for this part, I like to start by just going with colors that are kind of close to each other. So the blues and the greens, they help create just a simple palette. But if you're feeling like going crazy, go crazy. When you mix too many colors together at once, it does get a little muddy and it turns a little brown. So if you don't want that to happen, limit yourself to just a few colors, and that'll help keep everything feeling kind of clean but still really fun. Okay. Great. So this is a good place to let it dry, take a minute, and I'll show you how we're going to start integrating these two things. So what I've already done is earlier I painted a few different color palettes that we can draw on. And we're going to go back into this blind contour. So let's see, I'm going to choose this green one. Let that sit there. And for this one, I'm actually going to use my pencil. So this pencil, because it's going to show up really dark, is an 8B. It's the darkest, softest graphite that you can find. A normal pencil that, like a number 2 pencil, will work fine. It's just going to have a much lighter line. So on this dried color palette, I'm going to go back and I'm looking at my object, and we're going to do another blind contour. So again, the principles are: look for the outline, don't look at your page, and don't lift up your pencil or whatever you're drawing with. Okay. Entering the no judgment zone. All right, here we go. What I like about the way that these kind of layer together, drawing on top of the already painted paper, is it gives this kind of break from the rules that everything has to be in the lines and that it has to make sense. I think watercolors and a lot of art making is really fun when it stops making such straightforward sense. It's like the secret doesn't always have to have an answer when you're making art. Or maybe that is the answer. Who knows? So I like to do these pretty quickly. A really fun thing if you have a roommate or a photo of somebody is to do a blind contour of a portrait. They are just really silly. Okay, so you should be able to see it down there. I'll also show you here. So what I think is really fun about this is now we have this layered feel where like that can be done if I didn't want to do anything else to it. I think that with the blind contour, we get to lose control of how things have to feel, and the way that they interact just coming from our brain can be really interesting compositions. So that's watercolor first and then drawing on top of it. Now here's what happens when we draw in a pen first and then we watercolor on top of it. All right. So I'm gonna mix a little bit of this yellowy green. And with watercolors, don't worry if you have a little bit of one color that gets kind of dried on top of your other color. They're pretty easy to clean off later. Okay, so that was the green that I mixed. It's kind of close to how this leaf looks. And I'm gonna follow the drawing for this. So I'm gonna think of where that plant started. And as you see, almost immediately, the ink interacts in a really interesting way with the water, I think. It immediately loosens from the line, which I really love. If this is something that drives you insane, you don't have to watercolor on top of your drawings. But this is what it will look like if you do. Some pens bleed a lot less than others, like the ballpoint pens really don't lose as much of their line. And what I'm going to do now, where it's really watery, is I'm tapping in this darker color. And I'm letting go of how I hope or think that the colors will dry, because the water just does what it wants to do. It's really going to take control over the situation. When we're watercoloring, I should say though, that the most important thing to keep in mind is creating spaces where you want to leave your paper untouched, because it's really hard to add white back into a watercolor painting. The white of the paper will have a crisp feeling that white paint on top afterwards really won't have. So just know that where the color goes, you've lost that as your light source. So I typically think of getting my shadows painted in first and then eventually adding. You can always add more color, you just can't take it away. Let's see, I think that might be. And then for this one we got little brown for the dirt. Now here, I'm adding water before the paint, and I'm going to just drop it in. Okay. So, again, we've got the abstract colors just interacting with each other, blind contour on top of those, and then color into the blind contour. And once that dries, you can continue on and you can keep adding any kind of more like color or paint or whatever it is that you want to have. So for this one more, how about we do something? I'll use my yellows. Okay, I'm gonna do a blind contour with a pen on top of the already colored paper, and then we'll go back in with fresh paint. So you'll see what happens when you kind of layer everything together. And I hope that this gives you guys plenty of windows of experimentation with your watercoloring and drawing skills. All right, so I'm just gonna turn this a little bit so I get a fresh perspective. There we go. All right. I'm going to find a point that I want to start with. And for the blind contours, so if I'm doing a face, for example, I tend to always start a blind contour with one eye. I just choose an eye and then I create the face from there. And with these, I've been starting with the leaf that's closest to me. But if your eye is drawn more to, say, where the pot starts and then creating that space, it's all about reference points. And again, it's what works for you. There's really no right or wrong answer here. Okay. So that being said, I'm going to start with the part that's close to me. And here we go. Now this plant might be a little bit tricky for the very first time you're doing this. So if you had, I didn't remember to get a bouquet of flowers or anything, but if you have one flower or something that's just a little bit more simple, that might feel better to start with. You can always give yourself a good challenge too. I'm using my other hand to know where the bottom of the page is so that I don't draw on my table. Okay, well, look. So that's where I'm going to stop that one. Okay. So now I'm also going to go on my second layer with colors that interact totally differently. I'm going to go back with some greens. The oranges will shine through, and since I've already covered up what might be my light or whitest part of the page, I'm just going to roll with it. My light source is coming from this side. So I know that this side of my plant is going to have more of the yellows and the lights, and then this side is more in shadow. So that's something that I'm thinking about as I look at the colors that I'm painting, just observational skills of drawing from an object. All right, so let's see. And play with colors. I'm choosing to stay within this reality that plants have green leaves, but if you want this plant to have orange or purple or blue leaves, it's all your aesthetic, and it's whatever your color combinations that you enjoy seeing look like. This is funny, it kind of looks like the plant's about to fall over. And say you're like, okay, I've painted, and then I've drawn, and then I've painted, and now I want to add some more background or texture. Adding cross-hatching on top can create really interesting design to what you're doing. So let's see, I'm just gonna start here. This is something that you can practice anytime, but figuring out a way to create some like line shapes. Just playing around with how do straight, consistent lines look with loose and free form, and just building on all of that. And then, like you can see here, that Sharpie is going to hold a lot differently than the other one, but maybe you want to add paint on top. So the thicker your paper, the more play you have with this. The thinner your paper, just be gentle, because it might start to, the water might start to rip it. But there we go. So I hope that you have fun and you play with colors and are enjoying spring as it comes as best you can, and getting outside in safe ways. And when you're inside, any object you have nearby could be your next squiggly piece of new art. So thanks.